What's up? This is a webinar on a multicultural conversation on sustainability, where it's a free-flowing conversation. So we're all just going to share our perspectives on sustainability. Again, hi, I'm Yesenia. My pronouns are she, they. I'm a third year. I'm majoring in urban studies, and I'm a student assistant at the Sustainable Food Garden, and I also help run the garden's social media. So that's how I'm connected to the Institute for Sustainability.
I'm Elline. I'm a junior studying business law. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Philippine immigrant, and I'm the research and marketing assistant for the Institute for Sustainability.
I'm Karina Jimenez. My pronouns are she, her. I am a student assistant for the food garden, and I'm majoring in geography and minoring in geology.
So the purpose of this webinar is for kind of a way for us to show that sustainability looks different for everyone. Depends on your resources, your means, your upbringing. In this case, we're going to be talking about our different cultures and ethnicities. And we want to talk about how Indigenous and communities of color have been practicing sustainability for a very long time before it was popularized. We're also going to go into the differences between zero waste and low waste and how that ties into how people practice sustainability on an individual level. And lastly, we'll provide you with ways to get more involved in your community.
So what is zero waste and what is low waste? Zero waste is a movement that focuses on waste prevention, while low waste is more towards an individual level where it's less rigid and people can choose to purchase items that will make less waste.
And zero waste can be a problematic term. It's not a bad term at all, but I think people just tend to misunderstand that zero waste is a very rigid lifestyle and system, and it kind of puts a lot of pressure on an individual to produce zero waste, where it's a little bit more attainable for corporations and large organizations since they have the means and the resources to accomplish that. There are live zero waste lifestyles, but it's sort of unfair to expect that of everyone, and that's where low waste comes in, where you just kind of do what you can when you can, and there's no shame or guilt in not being zero waste. And it's also important to note that zero waste is not always ethical. There's still a lot going on behind closed doors that you may not be aware of in terms of zero waste. And if you're interested in trying out any low waste practices, these are some ways that the three of us try to incorporate low waste into our lives that don't require a lot of financial investment, such as repurposing household items. Like I eat a lot of yogurt, so I just wash out the yogurt container and I use that as sort of like Tupperware, or you can use it to plant. We also do like clothesline drying. You can use a menstrual cup, which is a really great option for menstruating people. Only buying what you need for food so that you're not producing as much food waste. So it's just these little things that are low waste and don't put too much pressure on you to perform a certain way.
So
I think all these are good practices as well, because like y'all mentioned, like the zero waste movement has been more focused on the individual as well, when in reality it's not really the individual's problem. It's more so the corporations and the system at place that has produced a large amount of waste.
Yeah, and like different cultures, ethnicities have also been doing low waste practices for a long time. And I think Karina was going to talk about what they used to do in Mexico that also influences agriculture today.
Yes, so here I'll talk about the pre-colonial agricultural practices in Mexico. So what we're seeing here are the chinampas, and they're known as the floating gardens. Technically what this is just small plots of land on a lake. So how this works is basically you have the water that is used to irrigate the plot of land, and you also have the fish and the fish waste that is used to fertilize the crops. And so the indigenous people really knew how to work with the environment and how to have every organism help itself. And that's why I have like symbiotic relationship. Here I have like just like the diagram on how it worked. And basically they would pile soil on and some other foliage and some mud and just layer it up until it's a raised bed. And on the corners, they would add willow trees so the roots can be used to prevent erosion. And obviously, we have the lake that is used to like seep in for irrigation.
Your symbiotic relationship part also reminds me of like the hydroponics that we see now. It's like the aquarium with the fishies in it, and then we have plants or vegetables on top.
Yeah, cool. It's a great use for nitrogen, and it's rich in phosphorus, I believe, or phosphorus. So our contemporary agriculture, that obviously is immensely different because we have climate change that's playing an important part in the yields. And we also have increase in population that clearly increase the demand in food. So now we came with the creation of genetically mutated organisms. And while this is a very controversial topic on like the sustainability behind it, I bring it up because in terms of sustainability, we can only manipulate nature so much for our convenience, while nature will always bounce back and you continue its natural system. So at the same time, like in Mexico, there's a lot of indigenous people that practice agriculture and hold a lot of value and respect and find maize sacred towards them. So when they're being forced by, organizations and giant agricultural corporations to use GMO like maize, it becomes conflicting for them because it's against their culture and like generations and generations of what they've been practicing. So there's a lot of indigenous resistance even now.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know on the consumer side, like when people are grocery shopping, they, look down on GMOs because they're like, what am I eating? But then they don't really think about this whole side of, it's invasive to indigenous culture. So I think that's a really interesting perspective. It's something new I learned.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, indigenous people have resisted for many, many years. And as an indigenous person myself, my family, we're Zapotec. We come from the southern state in Mexico called Oaxaca. And the Zapotec people reside mostly in the Valles Centrales, which is a region in Oaxaca, but there's in Oaxaca holds the largest groups of indigenous people compared to any other state in Mexico. So how does climate change affect indigenous people, and how are indigenous people fighting and fighting for their land? That's really important because as much as 80% of the world's remaining forest biodiversity lies within indigenous people's territories, and indigenous and community lands store at least 24% of the above ground carbon in the world's tropical forests. We see that indigenous people have been at the forefront of this climate change movement, and really a lot of social justice movements. But it's important to note that although they only make up less than 5% of the world's population, they account for the 15% of the poorest. And that's really, really bad, because Indigenous people are among the first to face the direct consequences of climate change due to their dependence upon and close relationship with the land. And a lot of Indigenous groups live in symbiotic relationships with the land as well. A lot of them rely on the resources that the land provides, and rely on the land as like protectors. And so when this climate crisis is, we see more of the effects of it. It becomes to be scary, because like a lot of these Indigenous groups are the ones at the forefront, but also going to be the ones most affected by it. And I also wanted to note that Indigenous land defenders are criminalized and murdered at higher rates than any other demographic. And so a lot of them are fighting for the land, even though systems of oppression continue to bring them down for the profit of the money, sadly.
Yesenia, I was wondering if I can ask you a question. What are your thoughts on people who borrow methods from Indigenous people, like, to try to preserve the environment? I know there's a lot of people who are kind of harkening back to Indigenous methods. What are your thoughts on that as an Indigenous person?
That's a good question. I think it really depends on the community that people want to learn from. If that community is open to sharing their knowledge, I think they're doing that for the greater good. But also it's important, I think about the term land back, and this movement of Indigenous people fighting to get their land back. And although, like, I think about what that looks like, and many people think that, oh, it's returning the land back physically and just letting the Indigenous people of the land stay there. But it's really not. Indigenous people don't look at land as property. It's more of them trying to reclaim their land by being the leaders in those spaces and taking up the space to make decisions, legislative decisions that are going to impact them and the land. And so I think about that because when people are leaning on Indigenous groups for ways to save the earth, it's, if we want to do that, I think we need to pay these people. We need to give them power to really learn from them and see them in these leadership positions, so that we are able to gain knowledge. And I think once these Indigenous people have these powers and they are able to make decisions on their land and have their lands back, then we can see that change happening.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add, I really think it's important that we should remediate the land, especially if we're like the number one consumers from these corporations. So I think I totally agree with you.
Mm-hmm. And Yesenia's point kind of brings us to the topic of environmental racism, which has to be discussed if you're talking about any type of sustainability. Environmental racism is defined by green action as the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. In particular, it refers to institutional rules, regulations, policies, or government and corporate decisions that deliberately target communities who are in undesirable locations. And they also have very lax environmental laws and policies, especially for communities that are exposed to toxic and hazardous waste sites based upon race. The Philippines is an archipelago made up of over 7,000 islands with over 1,000 dialects and is home to many Indigenous peoples. We are still recovering from centuries of imperialism and colonialism. And a symptom of that is how our country is disproportionately affected by pollution. One of the quotes that really grabbed my attention when I was doing my research is this one from Philstar Global, which pretty much says the Philippines is the deadliest country in Asia for environmental and land activists. And that data is from just last year, 2019. And in the photo to the right, you can see them protesting the construction of a dam that would displace their community and destroy their ancestral domain. Indigenous land defenders and farmers are actually red tagged by the Philippine government. And red tagging is a political tactic used to silence dissent against the government. Nearly 90% of the killings in 2019 occurred in Mindanao and the Negros Islands, which are the southern islands of the Philippines. And during COVID, just during COVID, at least 557 environmental defenders experienced physical assault, illegal arrest, and harassment lawsuits, and a ton of other human rights violations just for trying to keep the planet safe and the people in it safe. The Philippines and other developing nations are used as sort of a dumping ground for landfill by first world countries, and there's also a ton of labor exploitation. So particularly in fast fashion, if you see something made in the Philippines, you know, try to question if this was made in a factory that treated their employees ethically. And about 70% of the Filipino population has no access to disposal facilities and sanitary landfills, which contributes to all the waste that's on the land. So yeah, there's not a lot of infrastructure to ensure that there's proper waste diversion. So there's nowhere really to put trash. So that's why there's so much trash on the ground along our oceans, is because we don't have a lot of help from the government to take care of that trash. And you can see here, this the photo on the far left is the plastic waste washing into Manila Bay, and it's covering the beach and the mangrove trees of Freedom Island, which is a protected area in Manila Bay. You can see its location on the map, so it's right there by the Pacific Ocean, so that's also influenced by the Pacific Gyre, which brings trash onto our coast. And on the right, you can see people picking up trash, and like I said, there's high levels of garbage collection, but there isn't really like proper infrastructure to divert all that waste and to make sure none of it goes back into the ocean. And because there's so much waste, people tend to blame Southeast Asia for the world's pollutions. In 2015, a senator from Rhode Island said in a Senate hearing that over 50% of plastic waste in the oceans comes from just 5 countries: China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka, and that their upland waste management systems are a failure. And while it's true that we don't have much waste management, the plastic comes from somewhere, right? And, you know, as a capitalist nation in America, we can only assume that a lot of our plastic ends up in places like the Philippines, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka. And when America popularized plastic in the 1960s, they put up this like Keep America Beautiful campaign because they didn't know where plastic was going to go. So they just said, you know, don't litter because we don't know where it's going to go. And you know, they brought up this campaign of keeping America beautiful, but in hindsight, all the trash was going elsewhere. So what you see as beautiful in front of you is actually really ugly when you look at where all the plastic is ending up. And first world countries just get away with the dumping. Now, what's being done about this is a very slow-moving process because, you know, the Philippine government has been known to silence any dissent, and part of that dissent is environmental justice. There's a Break Free from Plastic campaign led by Von Hernandez, who used to be a global coordinator from Greenpeace, and he's helping with like brand audits on Freedom Island in Manila Bay. So they take a look at all the plastic that's polluting the bay, and they look at the company to see who's the biggest polluter. And so far it's Colgate and Unilever, and they impose that companies should be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And there's also zero waste communities, as you can see to the right side. They're trying to sort their waste to attempt to be zero waste. Hulong Duhat is where that one's taken from, and 15 other neighborhoods are also trying it out. with varying levels of success. And all of this is basically just to show that environmental racism is not an isolated incident. It doesn't exist just in the United States. It's a transnational issue. Whatever we do here affects other countries, and it's perpetuated by capitalism.
I just want to acknowledge like how much resistance people have against these like systems of oppression. Like these people here are, although like the plastic pollution issue is not in their hands, they're doing anything they could to fight back and like get something good out of it, because you know they care, and that's what they can do. So yeah, like Elline mentioned, capitalism, what is that? A lot of folks have been saying capitalism is at fault for climate change and many other issues, but let's dissect what it is a little bit. It is a social economic system in which private ownership means profit to the owner. The owner controls the means of production, so the profit belongs to the private investor. However, in a capitalistic society, the means of production is made as fast as possible, as cheap as possible, in order to get the most profits. And so in the United States and many other nations around the world, there are capitalistic societies and countries, but capitalism is not the only economic system available. However, we see capitalism in a sense, today we're living it right now, right? We see many of the things we get, many of the things we see in stores, where are they made from? Many of them are made in other countries, specifically like third world countries. And where the wage is so much lower than here, and so many countries rely on that exploitation of labor in other countries for the profit, for the profit, right? So how is capitalism unsustainable and ethical? Well, in a capitalistic society or country, workers produce more value for the capitalists than what they are paid for. This production must be done as quickly as possible and at the lowest possible cost. This is why companies exploit resources at an unsustainable rate, whether in the form of excessive livestock grazing, fast fashion, overfishing, and many other forms of overexploitation that do not allow for the natural cycle to replenish. And we see that, like, an example is like agriculture. Here, there's so much agriculture, and like people are just planting, growing food, like on an ongoing cycle, and the soil is not having time to replenish and to live, and so that's where we're using GMOs and other products to keep that cycle going, and not understanding what we're damaging and who we're using as people to do the labor. But also the system requires constant growth for the consumer, regardless of the effect it has on the earth and people's livelihood. So it's important also to acknowledge that capitalism isn't possible without the exploitation of people and the land. Like there's always going to be like poor people at the bottom, and there's always going to be really, really rich people, a small percentage of rich people on the top who benefit from this exploitation. And it is really like unethical and unsustainable, and that's why we see what we see today, the climate crisis and the exploitation of people. So what does capitalism have to do with the climate change issue? So like I said, capitalism's production of like plastic and just massive industrial waste and fast fashion, textiles, things like that really do harm the environment, and many of these industries generate greenhouse gases, which are responsible for the global climate change. So greenhouse gases are the gases that are warming up the earth and is responsible for the climate change crisis. So Carbon Majors research finds that only 100 active fossil fuel producers, including ExxonMobil, Shell, BHP Billiton, and Gazprom are linked to 71% of industrial greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. And so there are really only a handful of corporations who are responsible for the most amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the United States is actually the second largest contributor to greenhouse gases. Actually, the U.S. military churns out more greenhouse gas emissions than entire countries. In 2017, the U.S. military brought about almost 210,000 barrels of oil a day and emitted more than 25,000 kilotons of carbon dioxide by burning these fossil fuels. So yeah, like once again, like these systems of oppression are like connected. So we see the military and how much power they have and their effect on other countries as well. So yeah, climate justice is social justice. Like I said, like these systems of oppression work together to create more oppression and to exploit people and the land. And without addressing one issue like capitalism, we can't address climate change and climate justice. So that's why I thought it was necessary. We thought it was necessary to address all these other systems that collectively work together to continue oppressing people.
What to walk away with? We definitely want to encourage everyone watching to learn outside from your culture and to do research and investigate things outside of the United States, because the United States plays a major part in sending, you know, like we saw with the Philippines, trash and like other problems anywhere else. And so like Americans don't see that. So definitely always do research and investigate.
Yeah. And, you know, in terms of your own community, I know it's kind of hard right now with COVID to be super involved. But, you know, participate in cleanups, try to host your own cleanups, and acknowledge that you're not completely 100% responsible, but you are doing something to help at least, you know. So just doing consciously and mindfully making choices every day that not only, you know, helps get rid of waste, but also learning from other people around you. And just because you don't see something happening doesn't mean it's not happening. And yeah, that's like Karina said, that's sort of why we felt this chalk was important. You know, as grim as some of it sounds, it's the reality of the world. And we hope that you all learn something from it, and then you can talk to your friends and family about it. And there's a bunch of influencers on Instagram who are Filipino, who are Mexican, who are Indigenous, that still advocate for sustainable lifestyles in an approachable way, in an informative way. So, you know, try to diversify the content that you're seeing on your Instagram, on your TikTok, whatever social media it is. Ask yourself, am I following someone who's Indigenous? Am I following someone who's Mexican? Am I following someone who's Filipino, who's talking about the issues that are so important today? So, yeah.
Yeah, also like we talk about like social justice and climate justice, but what does that mean to you? And like, how do you imagine a world where climate justice is happening, social justice is happening, and how do you see yourself playing a part in that change? Because the change is happening now. There's a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of grassroots organizations that are happening in your community. So a quick Instagram search will help you like find these communities and like Elline said, it's kind of hard during COVID, but things are still happening and there's still a lot of work being done. So really do that work if you would like, and if you would like to see that change. Also, like if you can't, like find other ways that you can, like doing that inner work and getting educated, but also if you have the means, like donating to these groups that are doing the work. There's a lot of Indigenous, Black people that are on the front lines of social justice movement, the social justice movement and the climate justice movement as well. So yeah, do your part, do your best, and yeah.
So we'll now go to the live Q&A.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Yesenia. We had our recording, but we're here now. And we're open to any questions you all may have, if any.
Yeah, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A section. Oh, also, I know we mentioned menstrual cups as a low waste option. The Institute does have a ton of menstrual cups for free. You can send us an email and we can work out how to get it to you. It's sustainability@csun.edu. All right, Richard has a question. Says, what suggestions do you have for folks in Los Angeles to get involved with already existing environmental groups driven by people of color? Yesenia, I know you're involved in a lot of like grassroots stuff. Do you want to take this question?
I am actually not involved in any specific environmental groups. I know of a couple, EYE, I mean, EYEJC, I think is what it's called. East Yard for Communities. I'll write it down in the chat. I don't remember, but they do work related to getting toxic facilities out of their neighborhoods and holding them accountable for their toxic waste and like environmental racism and stuff. But I am mostly just connected to the social justice aspect. I know of many like groups doing social justice work. If you're interested, I'll write a couple in the chat and you can check them out.
Yeah, and I'd encourage you to do research as well. Anyone who's interested in it to look into it. And if you find one that you like, then consider reaching out to them and see if there's any way you can volunteer, and either physically or virtually, to try to check them out, either through Instagram or Facebook. There's a lot of communities out there. Yeah, so Yesenia has some organizations in the chat if you'd like to look into those. And this webinar is also been recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel soon. All right, if there are no more questions, we'd like to thank everyone for coming today and for engaging with us. And we genuinely hope each of you learned at least one thing that's new. The sustainability account has a social media account. It's at Sustain CSUN. And then we also have an Instagram account for the garden. Yesenia, it's the CSUN Sustainable Garden, right?
Yes.
Okay, right there. All right, thanks so much for joining, everyone. We have another webinar next week, October 30. Richard's going to be hosting it about nocturnal critters at CSUN, so make sure to check that out. We have more information on workshops on our website, csun.edu/sustainability, or you can also check out our Instagram accounts to keep in touch with all the upcoming workshops. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.